My name is Adam Phillips. I was trained as a child psychotherapist and I worked in the National Health Service for 17 years. And for the last 18 years, I've been a psychoanalyst in private practice and a writer. Welcome to my ex. When we have a traumatic experience, two things happen to us. One is that we close down, that we're in shock. The other thing that we do is that we find ourselves repeating the trauma, as in either going over it in our minds or going back to the traumatic situation. So it's like a sort of stun to our attention. Now, for a lot of people at the turn of the century, and indeed in the 50s in America, reading Freud was like a benign trauma. As in, they had the experience that I think we've all had in different ways, which is they came across a writer called Freud and they were amazed by how interesting and illuminating and intriguing and fascinating this writing was. But it was like a benign trauma in the sense that what happened was lots of people became Freudians. They couldn't make anything of it. They couldn't interpret it. They couldn't translate it enough. So it was as though they became followers rather than readers. And I think one of the things that's put people off reading Freud is the way in which he creates a kind of following. So there are too many Freudians and too few interesting ideas about Freud around. And I think actually today might be a very good time to start reading Freud, because in a way Freud has fallen out of favour. So it means there's no pressure or coercion on anybody to assume this is great writing or indeed of any interest at all. You can literally read it out of curiosity, knowing or not knowing the history that preceded your reading of it. So one of the reasons to read Freud today is that he illuminates, I think, if we happen to like it, lots of areas of our lives without telling us what to think. And I suppose another way of putting this is to say that Freud in a way introduces us and allows us the complexity of our own minds. His project in the writing is not to narrow our minds, but to open them up. And so I think that there are various striking things about reading Freud. I mean, if the question is, why read anybody? Well, the only reason to read anybody is because you find it interesting or intriguing or amusing or whatever. And so the reason I would encourage somebody to try Freud out is, I think, for two main reasons. One is that he reveals how incredibly imaginative and intelligent we are in our suffering. That actually our suffering is a form of communication. It's a way of making meaning. It's a way of talking to somebody else. So Freud has an account of what are called symptoms that make them like works of art. They are an attempt to communicate something. That's the first bit. So there's a real commitment in Freud to a kind of human community of mutual interpretation. The second reason, I think, to read Freud is that they're very evocative texts. That on the one hand, Freud informs you of the way he wants you to think about the mind and about a life and so on. But in the reading of these texts, you will find yourself having your own thoughts, I think. One is that I think that he, in one sense, he became notorious for being interested in sex. And this then took off in the culture in a rather oversimplified way, because Freud does not present himself as an expert on sexuality. What Freud says is, sexuality is very interesting in ways we haven't thought of before. It is meaningful in ways we haven't thought of before. So he has an elaborate redescription. I think very quickly two things happened. One was that, and this was true, that feminism found Freud oppressively patriarchal. In other words, it was very, very much a male view of female sexuality and indeed a male sexuality. So there was something already potentially narrowing about it. In other words, to a lot of people, it felt to be more of the problem rather than an answer to the questions. The other thing I think that was notable about Freud is that he has very mixed feelings about things. So on the one hand, for example, he's extremely interested and interesting about homosexuality. So on the one hand, he's saying, well, sexuality takes many forms, one of which, of course, is homosexuality. There's another Freud who is more official and officious, who says, actually, there is a normal way of developing. And so to be gay is, in fact, to be developmentally arrested. In other words, you can get stuck at a stage of being gay, as though being gay was a defense or a protection against being heterosexual, whereas it's quite clear that being heterosexual could be a defense against being homosexual. But I think Freud offended a certain range of people, quite understandably. The other, I think, reason Freud fell out of favour was because it was too narrowly individualistic account of a life. In other words, Freud didn't take into account the pressure of economics, the pressure of politics, the power of a culture that one lives in. So it was as though people felt this was a very reductive account of what a life is. I think a lot of people, as you say, are frightened of what's going on in their minds, and are frightened of being mad, and are frightened of feeling or thinking things that they would rather not feel. Now, of course, it's essential to Freud's system that we repress things because they disturb us. So if we then unrepress things, we will be disturbed. But I think one of the things Freud is trying to do is to help us be less terrorized by the complexity of our own minds. In a way, Freud is saying, well, look, there's a sense in which we're all what we call mad, but we needn't all be terrorized by the complexity of ourselves. We needn't all be terrorized by sexuality or terrorized by our aggression. In other words, there are ways of describing and redescribing and formulating these feelings and desires that might make them more viable, more plausible, more bearable, more enjoyable. Because one of the things that's easy to forget is that Freud is also on the side of our enjoyment. He's not, as it were, trying to terrorize us with who he thinks we are. He's also interesting us in the possibility of things being more enjoyable than we may realize. Because I think one thing that people tend to underestimate about psychoanalysis is that it's not only that you're going to discover disturbing things about yourself, you might discover very pleasurable, exciting, interesting things about yourself.